When I went to Oxford, I expected to fall deeper in love with literature. And in many ways, I did. There's something almost surreal about being there, right? With living history all around you, surrounded by centuries of books and conversations unfolding in beautiful, ancient, Gothic libraries. It's amazing. But studying there, I started to feel like something was missing. Often we were taught how to analyze literature before we ever really were shown how to read it and experience it in the first place. Before looking at things through the human lens that we all use when we read, we considered the lenses of power and ideology, politics, and historical context. As important as those might be, they're small. I noticed I was getting very good at reading about books without necessarily growing in my ability to deeply encounter the books themselves. And so later, when I began returning to the same books outside of that framework, it felt like reading again for the first time. It felt fresh. So in this video, I want to talk about 5 books that reminded me about what reading is really about in the first place. Books that pulled me out of this analysis mode and back into wonder and attention, into emotion, genuine encounter, and the transformative power of literature. So the first book here is one that I've spoken about before, but if we really want to understand the transformative power of literature, it's essential that we look at Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Reading this through a critical lens, we're going to look at things like aristocratic decay within the Imperial Russian Empire, right? We're going to look at the social policing of female sexuality or the oppression of women within a patriarchal society of some sort. Maybe hypocrisy within Christian morality or whatever. And those are all interesting lenses through which to view Anna Karenina, but they're so small compared to the richness that is offered by a transformative work of literature like Anna Karenina. What else is Anna Karenina about? It's not just sociological and political, it's human, it's immediate, it's psychological. It's about the unbearable human need to be loved. It's about that tension that we all experience between passion on the one hand and peace on the other. Right? It's about the search for meaning in a world where it's really difficult, where everything's unstable, everything's fleeting, happiness feels like it's here one minute and gone the next. Tolstoy absolutely exposes social structures, don't get me wrong. Anna is crushed by a hypocritical society with radically unequal standards for men and women. Sure, we can talk about that, and that's a very interesting perspective, but the novel did not become immortal because of that. It became immortal because Anna's suffering is not a sociological function. It's existential, it's spiritual, it's psychological. Tolstoy understands that institutions can wound people, but he also understands that the reason they do so is because human beings are fragile creatures that are capable of reaching emotional extremes of love and despair. The novel is much more than a sociological look at Imperial Russia. It's a series of questions, deep questions, so many questions that I can't ask them all because I don't even know them all. I have to read the book again and again, and each time I'll get new questions. One question that the novel left me with was, how should one live when neither desire nor falling into your role in society can fully give you what you want? It's an interesting question. Another book that we have to look at, it's not really a book, it's a whole collection, and this is Shakespeare, and in particular Shakespeare's tragedies. Critical readers will often take a Shakespearean tragedy like Hamlet. Let's look at Hamlet as an example, because that's probably his most famous tragedy. King Lear is an argument there, or Othello, but let's look at Hamlet. What is Hamlet about? I mean, if you look at it through the critical lens, it's power struggles, right? It's political. It's the legitimacy of monarchy or illegitimacy of monarchy. It's about patriarchal society, maybe, from a gender perspective. Maybe it's about the construction of identity through language. Now, that one's actually a very interesting and fascinating angle to read Hamlet through. But even so, it's such a small, narrow component of what the novel is that it just misses so much if that's the only lens through which we view it. Right? Because Hamlet's also about the paralysis of overthinking. It's very much about betrayal. It's about the weight of grief or the search for truth in a world that everything is chaotic and it's unreliable and you don't know exactly. There's a lot of falsity on the surface, right? And that terror of action and the terror of moral responsibility that comes with action those are components of Hamlet that are so human and so important. And part of the reason why we consider it one of the first psychological works, it's maybe a proto-psychological, but the fragmentation of self within Hamlet's psyche, we never saw that before. When Shakespeare wrote that, that was very new at the time. But we don't always read it that way, right? When we read this too critically, we can get in our own echo chambers where we're reading it through a very narrow lens that might be a component of the story, but really is missing a whole big aspect of it, right? And this is something really intelligent people will often do. They'll focus on one component of a story and forget about the basic reason that we're reading this in the first place. Sometimes a simple reading is actually more profound for this reason, because we don't get caught up in our own minds. And Hamlet's actually a great example of how this can go wrong. Hamlet himself is a genius, a verifiable genius, and things don't go well for him because of that, right? So, look, Hamlet is a purely political reading of it is going to explain certain aspects of court power dynamics, but that is not why we read Hamlet today. Right? We read Hamlet today because everybody recognizes themselves in him for different reasons, and that is something that is very rarely accomplished in literature, and beautifully so in the case of Hamlet and generally in the case of Shakespeare. So Hamlet sees too much, he feels too much, he interprets too much, and becomes the pinnacle of human consciousness, intelligence, inwardness, as Harold Bloom would say. And that is the reason it becomes timeless, and we continue to read this over and over again. A third book that is something that is not read well, I think, in the critical lens is Moby Dick. So Moby Dick is another book I read while I was in Oxford. Actually, it wasn't on the required curriculum, but we did talk a little bit about this. And it's about a lot of things. On a critical lens, I've read a number of essays, a number of articles that interpret it through that lens, and they usually focus on something like American imperialism or expansionism, capitalism, and an extraction in industry economy type thing. Sometimes they'll look at race with the Pequod, with Queequeg and whatnot. But to be honest, all of those perspectives are so narrow. Again, like we've explored with the earlier ones, they actually, in the case of Moby Dick, I think don't have a whole lot of merit. They might to an extent. I don't want to say that you shouldn't read Moby Dick with an American imperialism or expansionism perspective. Sure. But that's not why we read Moby Dick today, right? Differently from the case of Hamlet or Anna Karenina, where the society that it was actually in was very much a component of the story. Every book is a product of its time. Moby Dick is also a product of its time. It's a little bit different than other ones. But it's really not just about those things. It's about obsession as a substitute for meaning. When you look at Captain Ahab, is one of the most interesting characters in literature. It's about humanity confronting this kind of indifferent universe that doesn't care. And it's sublime. It's so much bigger than we can even comprehend. That longing of humans to impose order on chaos. And that's really the key here, right? I think it's that longing to impose order on chaos that gets misconstrued for American expansionism and all of that as a lens through which to read it. And of course, that is to an extent that you can read it through that lens. But it's much more narrow and much more limited in scope than looking at it, for example, zooming out on the human desire to impose order on chaos. I'd much rather read books through that lens if we have to read it through a lens. But even better, let's not read it through a lens at all. Let's read it as a spiritual work of awe and terror before existence. That's what Moby Dick is about, right? It's about the whaling industry, sure. It's about American economic and racial realities that happen. Yes, those are aspects of the story, but Ahab's unforgettable not because he's a bad dude or because he represents a whaler or a capitalist or something. He's unforgettable because he embodies this ancient universal human aspect of refusing to accept limitations. The whale is a symbol, right? But it's not a simple symbol. It's many things. It's mystery itself. It's the power of nature. Moby Dick is so many things, and Moby Dick survives because it understands both systems and metaphysical terror. Right? Sure, it's about capitalism, but it's also about the terrifying silence that the universe has when we confront the waves, the ocean, the sublime expanses. And that's something that every human has to deal with. The fourth book here is The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. Now, if we want to talk about a psychologist, Dostoevsky is a great place to start. And unfortunately, this is another work that is often read very much through the critical lens. Critical readers will often say it's about the collapse of religious authority and modernity, which honestly is not a terrible interpretation. That is a component of this. Class tensions in the 19th century, maybe not as strong, but sure. Patriarchal violence and inheritance, small, tiny sliver of what's going on here. And competing ideological systems, yes, absolutely. It's about that. It's about the psychological morality play that different types of people have. And each of the sons, each of the Karamazov brothers, has a different ideological system, and how they interact is fascinating. And 100%, we should read the novel in considering these factors. But it's much more. It's about the hunger to believe in meaning. It's about the consequences of freedom, right? The famous idea is that if God is dead, then anything is permitted. And what are the implications of that? That's a fascinating little exploration, but that's just a small, tiny sliver of what the Brothers Karamazov is about. And that itself, you could write whole novels on, whole tomes on. It's about guilt, it's about forgiveness, moral responsibility, the possibility that suffering can transform you into something more rather than just destroy you or take away from you. So when we look at Dostoevsky, he absolutely has this ideological conflict between atheism and socialism and rationalism and faith, and that is so fascinating to read, right? We all are compelled by these ideas and we want to learn about them. But the novel's real depth is because the ideas are lived out. They're not just argued intellectually, and that's the real power of literature, right? That's what we miss a lot of times when we look at things through the critical lens. Literature is not just about what happens and what are the systems that are being embodied, or the metaphors, like what are they telling us? If that was the case, then we could just read the Brothers Karamazov as a political tractate that's arguing, is rationalism better, or is socialism better, or is atheism better, or is faith better? But that's not what it is. It's an embodied experience of all of those things and the implications that we get to see through a life lived in each of those different areas. But even there, it's not so simple. So that is what we want to do when we read literature. We want to see things lived out. And I think that's actually much deeper on a philosophical level, looking at things in their embodied state as opposed to this abstracted state that we don't really know what the implications are because they haven't been lived. And so that brings us to the last novel here on the list, number 5, which is the Iliad. And the Iliad is another one I think that is, read so much in classics departments. It's read so much in universities. The critical lens, we look at warrior culture, aristocratic violence. We look at glorification of empire and masculinity and honor systems. And it's often usually about how these things are bad and whatnot. But however that lens is, that is just not what you get when you read the Iliad. When you read the Iliad, you can see those aspects for sure, but it's really a rich reading, and it's not psychological like modern stuff, but it's also not so archetypal that it's just not worth reading. Otherwise, we wouldn't be reading it thousands of years later, right? It explores things like these kind of intangible griefs that you notice between enemies who nonetheless see the humanity in one another, the destruction of rage and what that can kind of cause within the self, the destruction that happens internally and externally, longing for glory in the face of death, right? The fragility of human life, and because it's the Greeks, of course, fate is a huge component there as well. Modern readers will often approach it very much like it's a brutal warrior novel, and fair enough. I mean, it's foreign, it's different than our perspective, but Homer really humanizes nearly everyone in a way that is remarkable given the time frame it was written in. And the bad guys and the good guys, everybody's mournable, right? You want to mourn, you want to feel bad, you feel it hurts you, the war, the tragedy, the cost. And I think it undermines the simple heroism that we sometimes attribute to it, because that isn't what great literature does. Great literature is so much more vast, it's so richer than that. Achilles, right? He begins with this obsession with glory, but he is capable of compassion by the end, right? So he evolves as a character. And it doesn't just celebrate violence, right? It sees the humanity in that. And so it's part of the reason why we read literature in the first place. The whole experience of academic reading reminds me a bit of the ridiculous grown-ups from the Little Prince or Le Petit Prince. Many academics are like the geographer who is always making maps, but he never bothers to get up and see the land around him. It's like, he's always at his desk and he's trying to draw maps. And don't get me wrong, there are some wonderful professors. My experience learning was by and large actually quite positive, but unfortunately, a lot of times we focus so much on trying to analyze, trying to understand, trying to be critical in literature that we forget the reason why we're still studying these works in the first place. But bringing this all together, I realized, that literary criticism itself isn't the problem, but it's not the magical solution either, right? It perhaps has a purpose. If it's done right, it can be a powerful way to engage with literature, but it becomes limiting when it arrives before the experience of reading the book deeply and getting your initial interpretation, and not after it, right? Because we human beings, we bring our own experiences to reading, and that is such an important component. The first responsibility of literature is not to be explained, it's to be read, it's to be encountered. And everything else, interpretation, theory, analysis, only really matters once we encounter it, once that encounter has already taken place. And I think that learning that again has really completely changed how I read. So if you like this video, please comment, subscribe, and thank you for watching to the end. I'm wishing you well on your next literary encounter.